in 2017 to 2021, I was based at RAF Lakenheath. Feels so long ago now, and I have no idea how I let the time get away from me so quickly. Before my clips and video files of my time in the country get corrupted, I'd like to show you some of the more interesting sites I was shown or things I discovered while I was in country. I'm starting at one of the most surreal sites, an abandoned church that supposedly is incredibly haunted near Great Yarmouth in the little village of East Somerton. Hopefully, this little tour will be the first of many videos to come if I can find all of my old SD cards and notes. Maybe it'll entertain some of my old British friends from across the pond. But back to the story of the Witch's Leg, though. This is St. Mary's Church in East Somerton. You can see from this map that we're only a stone's throw away from the beach, and although beaches here in East Anglia aren't what pampered Americans are used to, it's easy to fall in love with this part of England. As I was told about St. Mary's, apparently the locals call it, at one point, Witch's Finger, because the tree here grew up out of the center of the abandoned church and, like a finger, pointed right to the forest canopy, almost in an accusatory way. But the most common explanation I hear about this oddly placed tree is that an old woman was accused of witchcraft and buried alive. And in this telling of the story, she was buried in the walls of the church so that she could be stepped on as a final disgrace, and it took root in the sacred soil, corrupting it and growing to destroy the church from within. The church seems to have been abandoned sometime in the 17th century. This is a good piece of advice to my fellow American airmen who get lucky enough to be assigned here. Pick one or two churches a week and walk in. All you have to do is ask the nearest old person or local bespectacled historian in a sweater vest, and they'll talk your head off. Make sure to write notes down, to cherish these memories, or even hopefully record them. And if nobody's in the church, it's more often than not, it's open. So you can just go in, and there's a lot of pamphlets that you can pick up on church history. Go in with a few pounds, and they love selling these old pamphlets from the 1970s. And most churches like this have an associated ritual that goes something along these lines. Walking 3 times around the tree at night will release the witch's spirit. That's what I was told about St. Mary's. Whether that's to offer a deal or to set the soul of the damned free depends on who's telling the story. St. Mary's was built in the 15th century, and in its prime served Great Yarmouth's Burnley Hall. Yarmouth itself is said to be very haunted for obvious reasons, a center of maritime trade at the height of the British Empire. The names of sailors are easy to find etched into the bricks along the alleyways here, a reminder of times long gone by. In the churchyard of West Somerton, which sadly I never got the chance to visit, you can find the grave of Robert Hales, born in 1820 as one of 9 kids from a very large family. People called him the Norfolk Giant, and he grew to the amazing height of 7 feet 8 inches and weighed over 450 pounds in his prime. He lived an interesting life, working in a circus, meeting Queen Victoria, and retiring to take it easy as a bartender in a London pub. He died peacefully in Somerton in 1863. Now, the next stop here is the Druid Stone of Bungay, which I've been told is pronounced Bungay. I took a lot of heat for my pronunciation when I visited Ireland, so a few are probably going to slip through in any video I make. By the way, this is in Suffolk, and Norfolk and Suffolk make up East Anglia. You can probably guess the etymology. When it was more productive part of Saxon England, the folks on the north and south were called Norfolk and Suffolk. It's pretty easy. Anyway, the signage here claims that the Druids worshipped this stone around 400 BC, and the locals in the village believe it was because the stone had the special property of producing sparks when hit with a flint. Folklore says that the Druids would have worshipped whatever god was inside, and in return have used the sparks for fire or for rituals and in cooking. In reality, we'll never know the truth because the Druids famously never wrote anything down, and the only contemporary accounts we have of their beliefs come from people actively wiping them out. Just like the Witch's Leg in Somerton, there's a legend that says if you walk around this stone a number of times, something paranormal happens. In this case, if you circle it a dozen times and knock, the devil either appears to offer you a deal, or you can cup your hand to the stone and hear it whisper back to you. It apparently got some attention from antiquarians in the 1920s and 30s who claimed it was either a glacial erratic, a rock moved during the last ice age, or some kind of a fallen monolith. Less creative types said it's probably a stone from the nearby Bungay Castle, which was repurposed and used as a headstone, possibly for an abnormally tall villager, which would lead to the legend of it being called the Giant's Grave. The castle here was built by Roger Bigod, a knight from Normandy, as part of the Norman conquest. Roger passed it down to his son Hugh Bigod, whose loyalty eventually was questioned by King Henry II. Forces of the crown seized the town of Bungay, but within a few years it was returned to Sir Hugh, who wasted no time in updating the castle's defenses. Their holdings in Bungay were strategic because it lies at a point where the River Waveney bends, and fortifying the castle with a new keep gave them a fighting chance if they were fighting the royalty. Sir Hugh saw his chance several years later in the Great Revolt of 1173 when King Henry II's allies turned against him. Hugh found himself on the losing side, but the Bigod family eventually reconciled with the crown. Still, the town was put under a brutal siege during that revolt, and after it fell, the castle was demolished. By the 1290s, however, this castle was back in the Bigod family under Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl of Norfolk. He eventually fell out of favor with the crown again, and after a famous fight with Edward I in 1297, had it confiscated from him. The castle was taken from the family by the crown, and it fell into a permanent state of ruin. The next stop here is a little bit more obscure of a story, but I'm always looking for a good witch tale or for some haunted graves. I found this in Hidden East Anglia, another amazing source run by a local who scours the archives and posts the info to the web. Some of the sourcing even came from an unpublished 1952 manuscript by Catherine Parsons, a local woman, but it's all properly sourced and in the archives now. According to the legend, an old woman died in 1860 in Horse Heath, a woman known for miles around by the odd name of Daddy Witch. She had a ramshackle hut built at a place called Daddy Witch's Pond, which the author believes is now across the road from the village sheep pond. The layout of Horse Heath has changed a little bit and now seems to be across the road from Haverhill Self-Storage, and that's what we're looking at now. Daddy Witch was regularly seen dancing in the fields at night, carrying on with old pagan rituals. Locals described her as an ancient, bony, and half-clothed in rags creature. When she finally passed away, they buried her close to her hut in the middle of the road, again, so that she would never be able to have a peaceful rest and that the locals would have to step on her as they made their way between the villages of Horse Heath and Cardinal's Green to and from church or work. This actually backfired and ended up unnerving the villagers, though, when they noticed that the spot she was buried on stayed dry after a light rain. They said that her body gave off an evil sort of heat that would dry the path. Even in 1935, when a fire was moving along the road, locals swore they saw it reach that section and turn right back where it came from. Parsons claimed that local school children had a tradition of nodding 9 times every time they passed by the spot, which they thought was good luck. The next stop here is the White Lady of Harston Road. This is another local legend from Hidden East Anglia, and it's in Harston, just southeast of Cambridge. According to Enid Porter's 1969 book, Cambridgeshire Customs and Folklore, there's a bridge over the River Cam, and here the locals swear they see a ghostly white apparition, one of the many white ladies of the countryside. For reasons no one in the village could seem to remember, locals regularly watched her jump off the bridge and disappear under the water. She would also haunt Mill Road, leading up to the Queen's Head pub. Now a little further away, and a little less haunted, is Highdown Hill. Legends tell of how King Ale was buried here. In the 8th century, in Bede's ecclesiastical history, it's said that Ale held the imperium or overlordship of the southern coasts, uniting many of the petty kingdoms of the Germanic invaders. He became a warlord king, and in the 9th century Anglo-Saxon chronicles, he was said to be the first Bretwalda, or Britain ruler. This was recorded 4 centuries after he died, and there's no real evidence that he actually held that title in his own life, however, but it's still very fascinating history. Anyway, early historians believed that this king may have been killed in the legendary Battle of Mount Badon, where he fought King Arthur or Ambrosius Aurelianus, the sort of leader that was attested to of the Brittonic people that were fighting back against the Anglo-Saxon invasion. A lot of modern historians believe that maybe Ambrosius was a real character after whom the legend of King Arthur was based. The indigenous Celtic Britons fought for centuries against this encroachment, and their victory at Badon came at a heavy cost. The leader of the Britons is said to have been killed, and although the battle was won, the war had already been lost. If he's buried in his homeland, he probably would be buried right here at Highdown Hill, an Iron Age hill fort in the middle of his domain. At the end of the 19th century, a large Saxon graveyard was excavated here, but that was before archaeology was taken seriously. So most of the artifacts were stolen or lost, and the property owner found the hall before it was reported to local authorities. So he and his workmen made off with most of the grave goods, and it's very possible, sadly, that this king, once believed to be the first Saxon king of the Britons, ended up scattered as bones in the ditch surrounding the old fort. Our next stop is at the weird Slayer slab, which I regret not being able to see, but I'll show you all around it. A couple of miles to the west of Hyden Hill is the grave of a dragon slayer. To be a little more accurate, it wasn't a dragon, it was a knucker, a Saxon word for a water monster. Folk tales say that the infamous knucker lived in Lyminster, a place now probably lost to history called Knucker Holes. These monsters were mentioned in the poem Beowulf and were common cryptids to the Anglo-Saxon newcomers, beasts that would ravage their new settlements. One day, the King of Sussex announced that he would marry his daughter to the man that could slay this dragon, and a wandering knight answered the call, killing the monster and settling in Lyminster with his princess wife. So the grave here, which looks a whole lot more Norman than it does Anglo-Saxon, is called the Slayer's Slab. I'm still kicking myself for showing up when the doors were locked, but most churches were left open when I was living in England. I've been using old pictures for this, but the sites from around the village are by me. For our next stop, we'll visit Chanctonbury Ring, and Chanctonbury is one of those places that gave me a very dark feeling, but I'd already read some of the stories before I arrived in the nearby village. One of the biggest mysteries about this ancient hill fort is just why Neolithic tools were found here, but there's no evidence of settlements before the Bronze Age. The ring is one of the most important sites overlooking the South Downs Ridgeway, and the presence of Stone Age artifacts with no associated sites suggesting day-to-day life might indicate that it held a ritual purpose for the ancient Britons. Aleister Crowley's close associate, and possibly his lover, a man named Victor Neuburg, lived 2 miles away with his wife in Steyning. Both Crowley and Victor Neuburg were obsessed with this ring before they had a falling out, and it should be remembered that Crowley eventually fell out with everybody in his life. According to Victor Neuburg, poet and occultist, this place was a place of deep spiritual power. Some of Neuburg's poems describe horrific sacrifices taking place here, and he imagined an ancient druidic order on the summit of the hill performing their mysterious rituals. Robert Macfarlane, a best-selling travel writer, recounts in his book The Old Ways, A Journey by Foot, his nights spent sleeping on the side of the hill. This was a disturbing experience, and according to him, he was finally stunned awake at 2 a.m. by the sound of screaming coming from the woods. Other legends say you can summon the devil by running or dancing 7 times around the trees in the center of the ring counterclockwise. In 1944, Frank Williams wrote in Sussex Notes and Queries that this myth came by way of a local pagan tradition. In ancient times, according to him, the cult of the hill would dance in the middle of the ring, which would be followed by a great feast. Now, what's so cool about this is that it shows these stories were still circulating and possibly even practiced well up into World War II. And I want you to imagine an American GI from either out in the country or New York or Oklahoma finding Crowley and Neuberg doing God knows what in these trees, or seeing a ring of candle-waving school kids in the middle of the night. It's just so cool to think about. It's an image that really conjures up a lot of mystery, in my opinion. But back a little closer to Lakenheath and Mildenhall, you've got Wandlebury Hill Fort, more often called Gog Magog Fort. Local legends say that a giant figure was once carved on the side of the hill, similar to the one you can now see at the Cerne-Abbas Giant on the southern coast. By the 1700s, though, it was overgrown and eventually forgotten entirely. However, Bishop Joseph Hall actually recorded this figure in 1605, and in 1954, T.C. Lethbridge, a famous archaeologist with a specialty in Anglo-Saxon history, but well known as the author of dozens of books and a fascination with dowsing and parapsychology, began his own study of Wandlebury Fort. He claimed to have found 3 figures: a shielded warrior, a horse goddess, and a sun god. He came to associate the goddess with Magog, the second son of Japheth, who was himself one of Noah's 3 sons. According to the Hebrew Bible, when Ham saw Noah's nakedness after the flood, he found it funny enough to call his brothers so that they could see it too. Japheth, in this painting dressed in blue, and Noah's other son, Shem, covered Noah with a sheet, and Ham was forever cursed, along with all of his descendants. Legends of Gog and Magog are found all across the British Isles, with many different variations. It's almost a subject worthy of its own video, something well beyond the scope of a little tour here. Anyway, in 1997, archaeologists brought a magnetometer to the site and weren't able to find any evidence that there were figures, but it's still interesting to hear the local folklore surrounding this fort because it is a very ancient place. Officially, the site was built around 400 BC as a fortified settlement with a ditch of hewn chalk. However, another archaeologist made a surprising claim. 4,500 years ago, factoring for the magnetic drift of the Earth, the site seems to align with the North Star, the midsummer sunrise, as well as the lunar solar maximum. Who knows just how ancient this fort is? Moving on up the country to the Halifax Gibbet, we find another place that's supposedly very, very haunted, and a perfect example of how unfair things could be back during feudalism. A gibbet is an older form of guillotine, more of an axe placed on a heavy object and dropped from a great height than it is a surgical instrument to kill people during the French Revolution. The historians tell us that this was probably built in the 1500s, but dates back to an ancient custom where the lords of the manor of Wakefield had the right to summarily execute anyone without trial for the crime of stealing anything worth more than $10 nowadays. The custom to the lords of Wakefield was that they could execute with an axe, which, as rough as it sounds, was actually meant to deter them from getting power-hungry. Executions were a difficult job physically, and it took a very strong man to do it. But this gibbet, totally unique in England, made the job as simple as strapping a petty criminal to a board and pulling a rope. This continued all the way up to the mid-1600s. It's not recorded exactly when the gibbet was built, but the first recorded killing was in the 13th century. The last execution took place in 1650, and over 100 people met their end here. But most names were never written down and are now lost to history. I remember hearing one story of somebody who miraculously escaped from the gibbet and ran over to the other parish where the lords of Wakefield didn't have jurisdiction. Years later, I'm talking 20, 30 years, he came back into town to visit his family, was discovered, and executed right here on the gibbet. So, by 1650, public opinion of the lords of Wakefield was unsurprisingly very low, and Oliver Cromwell himself forbade any further use of the gibbet. It was disassembled, but the foundations were found in the 1840s. After that, it became a symbol of the town, and a replica of the wooden gibbet was built on top of it. when I was up at the Halifax Gibbet, and this is on the outskirts of town, a guy walked up to me with a mask on, and he goes, well, I mean, you know, COVID, but he goes, "That's our mascot." And I said, "What, you know, where's the mascot?" Expecting to see like some sort of a mascot placed up in the gibbet. And he goes, "Oh no, that's our mascot, the gibbet. Some people, like some cities have towers, some cities have skyscrapers. That's our mascot. You'll see it on, if you spend time in town, like stickers on cars and bumper stickers and pubs. That's like the town's mascot." I think it's very cool that that's still sort of like the heart, the center of the town, and the base has been there for, you know, hundreds of years. It's always been there, and it's only been reconstructed pretty recently. Back in Cambridge, just a few miles to the north and west of the hill fort we just saw, is the Giant's Grave at Cherry Hinton. It's just south of the local airport and ties into the same legend of the Gog Magog fort. For centuries, the spring here supplied Cambridge with a fresh source of drinking water, making the little suburb of Cherry Hinton very well to do. This spring fed a little pond, in the middle of which is a tiny island that legends say was the grave of Magog, or of Gog Magog. Again, the legends have a lot of variety, but in Jewish sources, Magog is the grandson of Noah, and Gog Magog is the land that was given to him and his descendants. But there's many stories, and they all tend to switch it up, where Gog and Magog are two distinct people, and these, at the end of the day, are just folklore, very medieval. The Cherry Hinton Chronicle reported in 1854 that there had been a few giant skeletons discovered near Limekiln Hill, now cut through by Limekiln Road. The pond also has some legends associated with Robin Hood, leading the locals to call it Robin's Dip. In my opinion, all of this has a lot to do with the nice Robin Hood pub across the road from the spring, where most of these stories were probably cooked up. Over the last century, Limekiln Hill and Pit have been quarried, but there's still some trace of the old war ditch. That's what locals called the remnants of an Iron Age hill fort. And I hear that pottery and artifacts are still found around here pretty often. There's the Robin Hood pub, and to the left is the grave of the giant. Immediately to the left there is Limekiln Hill. And moving on to Icklingham, there's not much to see of the site nowadays, but Icklingham was a nexus of ancient cultures. A series of boundaries to the south of the village, called the Black Ditches, are thought to be an Anglo-Saxon extension of the very ancient Icknield Way, a sort of chalk pathway running from Norfolk all the way to Wiltshire, leading many people to assume it was an ancient pre-Christian pilgrimage site all the way to Stonehenge and the megaliths of the southwest. But with the recent discovery of Seahenge during the low tide, some think that this pilgrimage went both ways. It's fascinating to imagine a clearly established system of roads that Druids and pilgrims would take hundreds of years before Christ, roads that passed right through these villages. The All Saints Church in Icklingham, meanwhile, is from the Norman period with some pretty interesting crosses carved into the door. There was supposedly an ancient Roman Christian cemetery and font found here, showing that the church kept with the ancient tradition of building on prehistoric trackways. I don't believe in all of this, but a lot of the more esoteric people out there think that these facts prove the reliability of dowsing or ley lines, or the little-talked-about theory of the Pudding Stone Way that ran parallel to the Icknield Way. So interesting because many of these pudding stones were directly and intentionally, at least it seems so, incorporated into the walls of churches, so that later pagans could follow their ancestors' footsteps. I don't believe in any of that, but it is a very interesting sort of theory or alternative to traditional history of these villages. And now on to Woolpit. And the story here is especially weird. The Green Kids of Woolpit legend has only found a global reach over the last few years, but as the story goes, sometime in the 12th century, a brother and sister appeared in the village speaking a strange language that nobody could quite understand. They seemed to be starving, but oddly would only eat raw beans. When they started to eat other food, they lost their green color and their skin slowly shifted back to normal. Modern historians think these kids were refugees from conflicts of the day, or just a number of theories and alternatives, but strange details keep popping up. The brother passed away shortly after baptism, and after learning English, the girl claimed that they came from St. Martin's Land. Some other legends say that she told the villagers that everything was green there and the sun never shone entirely. So if they were refugees from the Flemish conflict or from different people along the coast, what would that have to do with these claims? Some modern authors claim this was a folkloric tale of an encounter with the last of the indigenous Britons, who were said to have held out not only in Wales and Cornwall, but also in the fens around East Anglia. Even today, there's a few Celtic prefixes on some of the villages deep in what used to be ancient swamps right around here. And finally, we have the Loddon witching marks. This is the last stop in this video, but I hope to do more. I've already done a video on St. William of Norwich, a controversial and now ignored blood libel saint who is shown in a painting on the rood screen here. It's done in a very crude style, looking cartoonish, which, if I remember right, was a sort of style of Flemish art at the time. There's a huge number of witching marks, which is what I want to focus on here. I think these are really, really fascinating. Some of them, ones that look like this, are called Marian symbols. AM is thought to mean Ave Maria, while the W is just an upside-down M, for Virgin Mary, of course. This is a kind of minefield, because the W motif is much more common than M. Some say they're maker's marks, and these are common, but almost every other old church has W's and M's, so many that it would seem impossible that it belonged to a single maker. I mean, if you've got a W or M on every single other brick, I don't think that that man built the church overnight. But moving on to another symbol, the so-called hexafoil, which looks like this can be seen all over Europe, from every historic period. I've also seen it on Roman and Jewish gravestones, the latter of which still use it very commonly to this day. The most beautiful explanation I've heard from a local, and this was years ago, is that it's supposed to represent a lily of peace, a symbol from the Middle East. They're symbolic of rising from the mud, above the filth, a beautiful clean flower surrounded by sin. They're symbolic of rising from the mud, above the filth, a beautiful clean flower surrounded by sin all around you.